Hello, I'm David Hunt. My guest now is somebody that I've known for quite a few years, and he is one of the nicest people you could ever meet. He is a producer, a kickboxer, and he has this band that I love their music, Parralox. You might know of them or you might not. He's bigger in Europe and Japan than he is here in Australia. John, hello and welcome.
David, thanks for having me on the show.
Absolute pleasure. I want to talk so much about you as a producer, because that's what you do a lot of the time. But you're also a nurse. I didn't even mention that you're a nurse.
That's right. Amongst other things, yeah.
Yeah, amongst other things. So let's go back. You as a kid, growing up here. You're a Melbourne boy, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. Melbourne born and bred. So actually I had a really good childhood. You know, there's a few rough edges here and there, as I guess everybody has, you know. So yeah, grew up in Ascot Vale, and then I went to Essendon Tech.
Did you ever think that you would end up being a producer when you were at school? You know, were you or musically trained or what?
This has come up quite a lot. So kind of yes, but it wasn't music, more or less. So I grew up in a very sort of musical household. My mum was always listening to, like, you know, vinyl LPs and stuff like that, so all different sorts of singers.
Who?
So Julio Iglesias, the Carpenters, Nana Mouskouri, ABBA, because my parents are German, so there was a lot of tradition.
German, not Dutch?
No, Von is German, Van is Dutch.
Right,
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, like listening to a lot of music growing up, so I had my parents' influence as well. So my mum was more of the emotional sort of musical person, whereas my dad was very, I won't say he's non-emotional, but yeah, he kind of was, but he's very technical. So yeah, my mum was emotional and my dad was sort of technical. My mother and I bonded over music and, you know, the things that mother and sons bond over, and my dad and I didn't have a terribly close relationship, but we did bond a lot over technology. Like, my dad was always the one that had the latest when the video cameras came out and the faxes, like he was on top of it totally. And he had a bungalow at the back with full of, like, it was like his man cave, you'd call it now. But he was into ham radio, and he had like all those little boxes with capacitors and transistors and resistors, and he'd make his own circuit boards. So I remember in grade 6, I was home from school sick one day, and he went to, I think it was Dick Smith or Tandy Electronics, whichever one it was, and got me one of those electronics kits. It's like a flat board. You got the spring coils, and you've got like a little relay switch and a light globe and a transistor and whatever else, and you get the spring coils and you get a wire and you put them between, and you can make like a radio, you can make a Morse code light thingy bob, and I just thought that was really neat. So, and I always kind of latched onto sort of technology at the same time, you know, listening to music as well. I remember buying the ABBA tape in, I think it was 77 or something like that. So at primary school, I'm getting to the point, there's a lot of roads to sort of travel down to answer your sort of question. So I think it was grade 5 or grade 6. My first instrument was saxophone, the alto sax.
Oh, okay.
So I was trained in that, and I remember cursing as a kid because, you know, I was only tiny and having to carry this massive alto sax, which is the smallest of them all, but as a little kid it's like, this box is like so heavy, you know. But I did enjoy the music side of it. So by this stage, it was only saxophone, there was no keyboards involved, and I hadn't really thought much about music too much. I mean, I knew I liked it and I enjoyed playing the saxophone, and I seem to remember the thing that really brought it to a head was like in the early 80s, I forget the name of the show, but my parents had like a quadraphonic stereo, and I was always bragging to everybody, you know, hearing, I think it was the Human League on radio, and all of a sudden hearing this synthesis of like amazing pop music with technology mixed together. It kind of sort of made me realise, hang on, technology and music can actually work together and make something incredible. And like back in the day you had Kraftwerk, and I was already listening to stuff like that, and I don't know, it just sparked something inside of me. It made me realise that, you know, music and technology can come together. Maybe year 7, so my best friend at the time went to the same high school as me, and I think I'd bought my first synthesizer. It was a DX100, and I had a DR110 drum machine. And we used to go to each other's places every weekend, and he'd lock himself away in his room and come up with some sounds and beats, and then I'd have a listen to what he did, and we did that vice versa. And so we came up with this idea of creating a production company called Association Pictures, because we both wanted to be filmmakers.
Okay.
Right? I'd started to have ideas of how would I take some artistic ideas and execute them, and what would that look like. So naturally, 2 teenagers who didn't know anything would start a film production company, you know. And the only thing we ever did was come up with a name. And I remember because I went to a tech school, so
Yep.
we were very handy with like, you had your woodwork and your metalwork and all those sort of different things. So we must have had access to glass etchers, right? You know, because we did that's right, we did sand blowing and also glass etching. So I remember getting this piece of glass and actually etching into it association pictures, and had it on our desk. So it was like first step towards conquering Hollywood, you know.
Have you still got it?
No, I wouldn't even know where it is now.
Right.
This must have been in high school, that's right, because we had the AV room and I was heavily involved in that as well. But as you would know, putting the visual medium together, like film, takes much longer to produce the music. So I think just naturally I sort of gravitated toward the music side of thing and realised you could have a much more quicker instant result. So I remember my very first proper paycheck, the first thing I bought was a Roland SH-101 synthesizer. So at a very, very young age, I knew I wanted to get into music. So from primary school I played alto sax, and then when I went into high school, although it was technically called a tech school, I joined the school band, but they didn't have a bass player, so I played the bass parts on the piano keyboard. And that's right, the way I learnt keyboard was the lady that used to babysit us in Essendon, across the road from Queen's Park, her name was Tessie. Now she had a son who unfortunately passed away, and at his wake, so Tessie, who looked after us, had this amazing house which I always wanted to live in because it was across the road from Queen's Park, and it was on Hall Street, and at the very end you've got this corner with these massive windows and you could just look out onto Queen's Park, and it was just, and she had her sewing room in there, so as a kid you'd go in there and it was so magical. It was like, you know, king of the world in this corner room with glass just looking at Queen's Park. I don't know, it's magical for me as a kid. So at the wake of her son, Tessie, she loved cats and she had exchange students. This is back in the 70s and 80s, so there's always like some Chinese or Vietnamese students hanging around. And I remember at the wake, the girl who was called Elizabeth taught me how to play Fur Elise on the piano in the space of like an hour or two. And I didn't know how to play piano, and I wanted to, but I just thought it was way too hard and complicated. So she sat me down and said, press that black one and then that one, and you know, after an hour or two, do, and I managed to pick it up. And then I said to Mum and Dad, have a look at this, and they're like, when did you learn to play piano? And I'm like, just now. So then I thought to myself, well, if I can mechanically know which buttons to press and actually come out with a half decent tune, well, maybe I can actually learn how to play piano. So I joined the school band, and we actually had a music class at school as well, but by that stage I was already sort of self-teaching myself chords and all that sort of stuff. So I guess as time went on, I just sort of started to buy more synthesizers and more drum machines and trying to write music, and not really doing much with it until 1987. My first proper job was at the Grand Hyatt, and I met somebody who worked there as well, and we got along quite well, and he had a friend who was also doing pretty much the same thing as me, like a kid at high school with synthesizers, loving music, discovering pop music, discovering all these amazing bands, getting inspired by music, and he put us together because, you know, I guess a lot of the people out there, we all do the same things unless we connect together. How do you know, you know? So that guy's name was John Collins, so we instantly hit it off. But he was more of a lyricist and top line writer, whereas I was more doing the musical beds and that sort of stuff. So it was a perfect match. So we started writing songs together, and we'd demo them at home, and sometimes we'd go to proper studios and pay a fortune for these songs that really wouldn't end up going many places. And then John met this singer in, I think it was King Street. She was doing a gig there, and he's like, oh, I met this amazing girl called Gina, and I played her a few of my songs and she loves them. And she's like, you know, let's write some songs together. So John and I wrote a few songs for her, and her name was Gina G. So,
right.
So this was back in, was it the early 80s or 90s? Not that I'm giving my age away now, but we ended up writing a few songs for, at that stage she wasn't Gina G, or she was Gina G, I think she was just Gina, but she was singing with Bass Culture, remember? Everybody. Yep. So we had, I think, 2 or 3 songs on their first and only album. And I think a few of those ended up on Home and Away or Neighbours. I mean, I still get residual ABBA checks from that.
Wow.
So yeah. So that was my first entry into like the professional sort of musical arena. So I signed publishing with Mushroom for those tracks. So, and John and I continued to work together on and off, working for various people. And then I think it was around about the same time I started my own band, Nova, back in the early 90s, signed to Sirius and then Sony Dance Pool. So yeah.
How did you end up then becoming the producer that you are today? because you're obviously doing it by yourself now, and you write a lot of stuff for other people. So when did you think, hold on, I can do this by myself?
Kind of just sort of stumbled into it by accident. So with Nova, I guess I was just default producing the music, not really realising that I was actually doing it. So, I mean, a lot of bands, you know, will be in a band or be solo artists and get a producer in, you know. That never really occurred to me because I was already sort of doing that. And I guess the record labels were happy with it. Otherwise, they would have got somebody else in to produce it. So I think Nova, we were together for maybe about 3 or 4 years. We had one single out through Sony and then I think another one through Shock. And then the singer that I was working with, Lilia Ozu, or now Mendoza, she went to LA, she went to America, and I think it was San Francisco. So after that band ended, a manager approached me, Jamie Jimenez, who was managing Culture Shock. And he's like, you know, I love what you do, I'd love to work with you, I'd love to manage you. So, and at that stage, you know, music management was sort of very new to me, and I'm like, oh, okay, that sounds great. What does a manager do, you know? So, I mean, I kind of had a half idea, but the band had broken up, so what do I do now, you know? So Jamie started managing me, and that meant me producing other artists, other bands. And so the studio that I had was actually my bedroom with a futon in the corner and everything sort of very tidy, and, you know, all computers and stuff over there. And it wasn't until Molly Meldrum came into my studio and was sitting on my futon doing a voiceover for the Robbie Williams concert, and my manager afterwards like, John, I think we need to get a proper studio. Because, you know, it's okay for, you know, we weren't having like, you know, world famous big names coming into the studio, but I guess we'd reached a point where, okay, I think we need to actually look at getting a proper studio space. So there was a space in the basement downstairs from where I was living, and we sort of looked at a few places, and but it's so funny, sometimes what you're looking for is right at your fingertips. So the basement we converted into a proper studio. It took like 6 months and a little bit of money, but turned it into like a proper studio. So then I think for the next few years we were producing a lot of bands, like Jamie and I would produce them together, or he'd generally organise a lot of clients, and I'd just be busy doing production work, so commercial. I think we did the Wog Boy, we did a song on the Wog Boy movie with Nick Giannopoulos, and we did the Rove Live theme and Before the Game and a few other TV show themes, working with a lot of independent bands, a lot of artists signed to record labels who wanted to demo stuff up. And that went on for like quite a few years, and I really enjoyed it. So, because it sort of got me to, you know, make a bit of money out of my, you know, at that stage it was like my hobby sort of passion. So when you can actually live off that full time and, you know, make some money out of it, it's great, you know.
But were you doing it full time? Because you were studying nursing.
Well, so yes. So like I said, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. So back in the early 90s, the girlfriend I had at the time, I mean, I'm gay, but I did have a girlfriend.
Well, didn't we all?
Yeah. So she thought it would have, I mean, she went into nursing straight after high school, and, you know, we sort of dropped out of touch, but then we got back into touch together, got back in touch. And we had this crazy idea that if we got married and went to Saudi Arabia, and if I was a nurse, that we could go over there and make money and tax-free, and it'd be fantastic. And so this was at the time when I was just starting the Nova band, so kind of at the start of my musical career. And I was working at the Hyatt, so I knew when I went to nursing, or studied when I was studying nursing, I knew I needed to work part-time. At that stage I was working in engineering. So I remember there was a nightclub at the Hyatt called Monsoons, and I went down there and I spoke to Beng Lim, who was the manager, and I'm like, hi, have you got a job? And he's like, oh, sure, what do you want to do? So I ended up being a bussy, like, you know, bus boy, picking up bottles and stuff. So, and that worked out perfectly, because I think I did like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or maybe just Friday, Saturday, something like that. So I had a weekend job, and I did my 3 years at uni to study nursing. And unfortunately, in my final year of nursing, Anne was killed in a car accident. So that was very sad and traumatic, obviously. And I don't know how I managed to get through the third and final year. I remember, I think for the first 6 months, I'd literally go to her mum's house, and I think we'd just cry for a few hours. I mean, that's the way we deal with the grief. So I finished my Bachelor of Science in Nursing, but I didn't actually do a grad year or anything like that, because my passion for nursing was gone. So I stayed on working at the Hyatt. So I think it was I went from busboy to bartender to assistant bar manager to bar manager and then assistant manager. I ended up managing the club for like the last 9 or 10 years. So while I was working on the weekends at the Hyatt, I'd be working in the studio full time. And then when Jamie started managing me, that's when I left the Hyatt and sort of worked in the studio full time, because I think at the time my father had sort of passed away, and I went through sort of a bit of a re-evaluation of my life and what was important and what wasn't important. And I realised, you know, we all have short lifespans, and we only have a certain amount of time on earth to do sort of things. So I thought, now's my time to really do what I want to do. So yeah, I left the Hyatt as much as I loved it and made so many good friends there. So I worked full time in the studio, I think for like 3 or 4, maybe 5 years with Jamie, and had a great time. Something maybe changed a little bit, because all of a sudden I remember, not that I was depressed or I don't know what I was feeling, but I remember waking up and not being terribly happy about what I was doing. And I just remember waking up one day and going into the studio and just looking at all these flashing lights and synthesizers, because growing up we weren't, you know, terribly rich or anything like that, and you know, nothing came easy. I had to work hard for, you know, all the gear that I got. So I mean, as a little kid I would go to Brash's and Allen's and play the synthesizers for hours, and I actually used to wag school on a Wednesday for sport. And you know, my friend Clinton and I would be like, oh, do you want to go into the city today? And we're like, yeah. So we'd like walk into the city or catch a tram and go to Allen's and Brash's, and I'd play all the synthesizers, and then we'd go to the arcade parlours, and I'd come back at 3:30 for my detention in the computer room, you know, and I'm thinking, to the school not realise, you know, like, here's a kid who's wagging school, coming back at 3:30 and I'd stress out. I'm like, quick, we have to go back to school, I'm going to be late for detention, you know. And here they're locking me up in this computer room, and I'm thinking, do they not realise this is not exactly a punishment for me, you know?
Yeah.
I ended up, I think for the first month or two in year 11 or year 12, teaching the computer class, and they paid me out of the chaplain fund.
Wow.
And I got paid $20 a class, which was a lot of money back then.
Yeah. But hold on, you'd gone off.
I know, I've gone off kilter. So
yeah, like, so you walked into this studio one day and went.
Right, so I had a bit of a re-evaluation of what was important. So I remember looking at all my gear, and I had, like, you know, mixing console and synthesizers and all the flashing lights and buttons, and thinking to myself, now as a little kid, if I had have plopped myself into that studio, I'd be like, holy shit, my dreams have come true. Like, you know, all the gear that I ever wanted, what's wrong with this story? Like, why am I not happy, you know? And I kind of realized I'd fallen into the same trap of sort of having a 9-to-5 job, a very routine job that wasn't really sort of creatively satisfying. Even though I was still doing music, I was doing other people's music. And I kind of realized, hang on a minute, I think I've maybe got off track here a little bit, you know, like all the reasons that I got into music were basically me sort of creating music and making music, and now all of a sudden I've turned into like a sausage factory, and there's really there's nothing creatively enjoyable about it. I mean, there is, but I guess I reached that point where I'm like, okay, I'm doing music for everybody else, like I'm being given directives, and it's not that I have a problem with being told what to do, but it wasn't very creatively satisfying. Yeah. So I was basically doing music for everybody else, and I thought to myself, what am I going to do? And I realised I needed to sort of get back into the original reason for me doing music, which was, you know, me creating music and being in a band, or whether it's me being solo or collaborating with other people. So I thought to myself, wow, I need to, you know, get back to the basics and sort of start making my own music, you know, as opposed to making music for other people. So at the time, I mean, I've been training like in Muay Thai and boxing for, God, like 25 years now, I think. So I think it was Underworld, which was now closed on Flinders Street, the Banana Alley Vaults. I was training there I think I was just doing weight training. And I remember, oh yeah, because I was into aerobics as well, but I remember they had these boxing classes in Muay Thai, and I'm like, you know, I'd sort of look past and see all these people punching and kicking these bags, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll give that a go, you know. So I did a few classes, and I kind of really enjoyed it, because I like the aerobics, but aerobics for me got a little bit boring. I was maybe after something different, and so I found the boxing, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. I really enjoyed it. And I think at the time Sam Solomon was one of our teachers, and Amanda Buchanan, who have gone on to do wonderful things. So, you know, I ended up doing, you know, boxing there, and then, you know, you meet a few people, you talk in class and you're friendly with people, and then there was a tall Italian guy called Robbie, who I ended up being friends with, and, you know, you sort of talk with people, and as you get to know people, they tell you a little bit more about their lives. And he told me he was in a band, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's nice, you know. And I told him I had a studio, and he was like, oh, that's nice. So not realising that, you know, how developed his band was and how developed my studio was. And then, you know, I really didn't know, you know, what level his band was at. And then he showed me, I think it was a review of his latest CD. I think it was his second or third album with that band, and he was a little bit down because the reviews weren't terribly good. I think it was something like the music was great, but the vocals weren't terribly good. I think it was more that the vocals weren't technically recorded well. You know, I mean, it's not so much a problem with the performance, but he was like, oh, shit, damn. Like, he wasn't really happy about it. And I'm like, dude, I have a recording studio. Why don't you do your vocals at my place? And he's like, really? Like, what sort of a studio do you have? And so I think it was a case of us underestimating each other, not really realising where we were both at, you know. So he came to the studio and he's like, oh, it's a proper studio. And I'm like, dude, yeah, of course it's a proper studio. So,
but as you said, he didn't know.
He didn't know. So, and that's, you know, that's fine. So, and so we sat down and I found out how, you know, they basically recorded their vocals in their bedroom, which is not a bad thing, and you can do it. And I mean, I was doing it as well, but you need a certain amount of equipment to do it properly, like pop shields and filters and proper mics and preamps and all that sort of stuff. So we recorded his next album at my studio, like the vocals, and then I think I actually got involved in producing one of the tracks by default, because that's right. I introduced them to like vocal harmonies. Like, first off, like, vocal production is a whole skill subset in itself, and that's one thing that all those years of working with Jamie in the studio really taught me well. It still serves me well to these days, is vocal recording and production, not so much just production, but also, I wouldn't say production of people, it's more about the psychology of recording and working with people in a studio. So as a producer and producer, you need a certain sort of hat to put on when you're working with people in the studio in order to get them to give their best performance, you know, like, and especially if they're in a studio environment and not so used to it, and they're on the other side of the glass screen and you're telling them, okay, sing, go, be perfect, you know what I mean? So people have different levels of sort of comfort in the studio. So you need to have that sort of, you develop a skill in terms of getting the best out of people, and the psychology involved in getting people to be relaxed and getting the best out of them, you know what I mean? So that was a good lesson I learned all those years doing all that production work, you know, even at the time, like I said to you, it sort of brought me down and I wasn't terribly, you know, thrilled with how it worked out. I did actually learn quite a lot.
Where's your studio? Tell people where your studio is. It's such an interesting...
You'll never find it. I won't give the exact location, but it's in Lonsdale Street in the city. So, and it's in a basement, and even... I mean, you need to text me when you arrive, because it's like a fortress to get in there, and it's so hidden. The first thing people say when they walk in there is like, wow, I had no idea this was here, because it's really, really so tucked away. And, you know,
which it makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, it's great, because it's got a great atmosphere, and it's like, it's close to Chinatown, so it's, you know, it's a really, really lovely space. So to get back to Robbie's story, we recorded the vocals for his new album, and they were all just so blown away, because all of a sudden they realised, like, they put so much work into the music, like, and the music sounded fantastic. And at the time they just weren't paying the same attention to the vocals. It's only because they didn't know how to, right? So that album came out and was reviewed, and they were also...
Who's the band?
That band is no longer about, but they were called Tanked, T-A-N-K-T. They're like an EBM, gothic industrial sort of dance band. Now they folded, and this happened at the same time as, you know, my sort of, that 5-year period where I was working full-time in the studio. Tanked ended, and Robbie and I were both at loose ends, and I don't know how the conversation came up. It must have been during boxing. It's like, well, why don't we do a song together? So I remember going to his place on a Saturday, and I'm definitely more electronic synth pop, Human League, Depeche Mode, Heaven 17, and he's definitely more sort of punk, Joy Division, New Order. I mean, if you had to draw a Venn diagram, it'd be huge, and we do cross over in the middle in some spaces, but he's definitely more punky and I'm definitely more electronic. But we did like some of the same things, which was great. So I remember a Saturday afternoon going to his place, and we went through his record collection. I think we just pulled out records that we both liked and drew inspiration from, because we're like, okay, we know we want to do something together, but what does that mean? What's the first step? What do you do? Like, you know, because he had his musical taste and I had my musical taste. So we got these bunch of records, put them together, and, you know, found a few sort of common denominators. And the first song we did together was called Hangman's Retribution. And so Robbie wrote all the lyrics, and it was a very dark, although we didn't know it at the time, we would go on to form a steampunk band with an amazing image. So we did the one song called Hangman's Retribution, and it turned out really well. And we're like, hang on, I think we've got a bit of chemistry here. So we put a band together called The 10th Stage, and it had to do with, I think, Dante's 9 Circles of Hell, or the 9 Stages of Hell.
Yeah.
And we both knew we didn't want to do some lovey-dovey, kissy-kissy, I love you song. We wanted to do something a little bit darker and with a bit more substance. And so we thought, what could possibly be what's worse than the 9th stage of hell? Well, it would be the 10th stage. You're like, you've done some really bad shit to get to the 10th stage, So we called the band The 10th Stage, and we developed this really amazing sort of visual look. It was the first photo shoot we had was at the old Melbourne jail, and I shaved all my hair off, and that's right, I think I had a monocle and a bald head and my white doctor suit, and Roberto was in like a straitjacket in one of the cells. So it was all very dramatic, And then the second album was all sort of top hats and very Elizabethan. But all the songs were very gothic and based on 99% historical events, generally murders and assassinations and very dark, gloomy, deep, heavy stuff. But one sort of interesting aspect about the band was you could get like a good historical knowledge of events that happened. You're like, oh my God, I didn't know that happened. Like, some French Revolution or some Italian uprising or something that happened in a certain country. It could be about a serial killer or a murder, but they were historical events. So it was almost like an education. So that band lasted for, I think, about 2 and a little bit years. And again, the same sort of thing started happening to me where I was getting a little bit sort of, not bored, but I realised, okay, I've kind of got my cake and I'm eating it as well, but I want more cake, you know what I mean? So what actually ended up happening was, I did start my own band and that was all good, but I realised, I'm missing out on a bit of the synth pop happy, so the synth pop side of things. So remember, this band was very deep and not so much dark, but it was very sort of serious, and it was an amazing band. And if I could, I wish it would still be going on today. But I realised I wanted to get more into the sort of, the synth pop sort of side of things, like dance pop, So, and this music was very sort of, theatrical and sort of, not that that's a bad thing. I mean, it was fantastic. So at the time, I think there was a lot of solo female singers like Lady Hawk and LaRue, and I just seemed to notice at the time in the charts, I think must have been about 2005 or 6, like a bunch of like female singers, like, doing this amazing stuff. And my friend Ken Evans, who's up in Queensland in a band called Tycho Brahe, we were kind of joking, saying, geez, all you need is, like some amazing looking chick with a synthesizer and you've got yourself a hit. And I'm like, okay, challenge accepted, So at the time, like, as I said to you, prior to that, I'd been working in the studio for like 5 or 6 years, probably more. And a lot of that is session work. So you'll have like, whether it's movie stuff, TV stuff, corporate stuff. When you need voices on that, what do? Well, you have session singers. So one of the session singers I was working with was a girl called Roxy. Anyway, so after speaking to Ken, and he sort of, it almost turned into a dare, and I'm like, okay, well, I can do that in terms of, creating a song and making something successful out of it. So I actually rang up Roxy and I said, oh, look, I've written this song. Do you want to sing in it? And she's like, yeah, sure. So I created a title, I Fell in Love with a Drum Machine, because I thought, like, what can be more amazing and synthetic than that? And all the synth blogs and all the synth fans are going to go gaga over a title like that, So I wrote the song and I came up with a band name, and it's funny, at the time I wanted to come up with this amazing, unique name. And I don't know if you've ever started a band and tried to figure out a name. It's one of the most painful things you can ever do, because it's like, how do you come up with an original name? So anyway, so I was quite clever and came up with this totally original name called Parralox. I don't know, it came to me out of the blue somewhere, and I thought, oh, I've done quite well, haven't I? So, and I created like a very strict design aesthetic for the cover artwork, even bearing in mind we only had one song at this stage. And because of my love of the Human League, I actually ran a website called Hysteria, which when the internet started, I was right on top of it. So I was there for internet version 1.0. And I ran an unofficial website for the Human League called Hysteria. And there was another guy in Sydney called Barry who did the main Human League website, which was called Dare. And everybody would have thought we were like, mortal enemies, but we actually got along like a house on fire, because we obviously both loved the band. But he ended up folding his website. So then he basically sent me all his files and I merged them into my website and ended up with this massive, mega, biggest Human League website on the planet. Through that, I actually created a site. It was almost like a mini Facebook before there was even social media, but I created a section on there called Members. And basically what it was is you send me in an email and a photo if you want, and I created this map on the website, and like there'd be Brazil and Greece and China and Finland and a name of people and their email address to get in touch with each other, so to create like a little community. So I ended up making friends with people I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, all these amazing contacts I made all around the world, you know, to bring people together over their mutual love of, you know, electronic music and obviously the Human League.
Did Phil Oakey know about it?
The band knew about it, but the band are very sort of, anybody who knows the Human League knows that they're very sort of, they keep themselves at a distance. So Ian Burdon, who was part of the Human League, ended up playing on the 10th stage and on my band Parralox. So we ended up getting in touch, and that had to do with the website as well. I'm glad you brought that up. So the band was certainly aware of the website as well, and I think David Beavers was their engineer. We were in touch, so even though I didn't talk to the band directly, they were actually, you know, grateful and thankful for the website. You know, I personally at the time felt they could have been a bit more involved, but that's just me. So I made a lot of, you know, friends with people all around the world, and some of them had these things called blogs, which we all know what blogs are now, but back in those days it was all new. So made friends with quite a lot of people who ran like electronic music blogs. So what I did when I created this band Parralox, I anonymously sent this song out to all these blogs, and they freaking loved it. And they were, oh, this new Australian band called Parralox, we don't know anything about them. And we started to get a lot of press. And then when my friends who had blogs started writing about it as well, I kind of started to feel a bit guilty, because I'm like, I need to be honest now and tell them who it is. And half of them were like, well, John, dude, we already knew it was you anyway. So, so then from that sort of, you know, tiny success from the band, it kind of made me think, hang on, there's something here. So we ended up writing an album in pretty much 6 months. And I think it was at the start of the year. By mid-year, we'd finished the album. By the end of the year, we were in London doing our first gig. This was back in 2008, I think. And we were support act for another artist signed to a label, I think Red Blooded Women. So Rowena and I, you know, landed in London, did this first gig, you know, didn't have any expectations. And then at the end of the show, like during the show, everybody was singing all the words to our songs. And, you know, we're looking at each other going, what the hell's going on here? And then afterwards we finished and people were asking for our autograph. And I'm like, they want our autograph. Why? Who are we? You know, it was fantastic. It was great, you know. And so I was on top of the world and got back to the hotel, and, you know, Roxy tells me, oh, I think I want to leave the band.
Oh.
So she actually wanted to, you know, focus on family and raising children and that sort of stuff. And so, of course, you know, I was a little bit, you know, sort of upset, but I couldn't be terribly selfish because, you know,
people make their own decisions.
People make their choices. Yeah. So, and we're still friends to this day. And I mean, so I found another singer called Amy, and she ended up being in the band for, I think, maybe the next 3 or 4 years. So to get back to what I was saying about the Human League website, Ian Burdon, the bass player of the Human League, I think he co-wrote Mirror Man, Sound of the Crowd, maybe Love Action and a few others. So as I said, on that Human League website, I had a section called Members. I also had a section called Dreams. And because I was such a tragic fan, I would actually have dreams of the band, and I'd be in a record shop and I'd pull up this record. It was like the limited edition of Dare with a red cover and 10 different remixes, and this song was a single and things that didn't exist. So I'd come up with all these amazing records and picture discs that didn't exist in real life. So then I'd use Photoshop and actually recreate all these picture discs and laser discs and singles that didn't exist, and the fans got a real kick out of it because it's like all these things that could have happened but didn't. So one of them was a laser disc, and it was like a James Bond movie, and 3 of the Human League were the good characters and the other 3 were the evil characters. Well, I think it was Phil and the 2 girls were the goodies, and then Ian, Philip and Joe Callis were the bad guys. And they all had superpowers. And Ian Burdon, being the bass player, one of his superpowers was like infrasonics. So he could actually project sound waves from his hands and shatter mountains and everything. Then one day I got this email out of the blue. Hi, my name's Ian Burdon. I just saw your Human League website. I loved it. And I'm kind of a bit freaked out because I read the section on your dreams thing about, you know, you created this amazing movie and I've got these superpowers. I'm just letting you know my dad's involved in the military and does research on infrasonics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was such a freaky thing. And so we ended up being, communicating and becoming friends. And then I said to him, "You're still playing bass?" And he's like, "Well, actually, I haven't played for a while, but I've been thinking about getting into it." So I bought him a sound interface and a few bits for his computer and sort of got him back into, recording bass guitar. So he recorded bass for a few tracks on the 10th stage. and continued recording bass for my band Parralox, and he's actually recorded bass on our current album, which is out now, called Genesis. So he's been recording with us, I think, now for 10, 11 years now.
And who's singing a couple of the vocals on this album?
Well, in Parralox, we've been very lucky to have quite a few amazing collaborations. So on the previous album, Subculture, we had Marcella Detroit doing vocals. She was in Shakespeare's Sister, who's just reformed now with Siobhan. On this current album, Genesis, we have the good fortune to be working with Jane Badler.
Whoa. Who Jane Badler, for those that don't know?
So Jane Badler was in a TV series in the 80s called V, The Visitors. So she played, I think, Queen Diana. So you've all seen that famous scene where she's downing the rat. And I think there was another one, Knots Landing, maybe, something like that. But she's been in quite a few, amazing.
And she's an American that lives here in Melbourne.
So what Jane's like, she had, TV success back in the 80s and still continues today. She does
cult following.
Yeah, big cult following. So she's still, she's still on, does TV and movie stuff even to this day. But I think about 10 years ago plus, she sort of started following her jazz roots. So she's quite and a lot of people just know Jane Badler for being an accomplished jazz performer.
Yep.
And I've seen her a few times at the Spiegel tent as well. So she's an amazing vocalist as well. So it's funny, some people know that she's an actress and other people know that she's a musician, and so depending on where they caught her, So I think it was maybe a year or two ago, some record label who I'd done remix and production work for are like, oh, we're working with this artist called Jane Badler. We thought you'd be a good fit to do some sort of dance electronic pop. Are you interested? And I had to think for like a microsecond, and I'm like, yeah, of course, I would love to. So we ended up doing, I think, 4 songs together. And when I was putting the current album together for Parralox, those 4 songs hadn't been released as yet. So I called up Jane, I think it must have been last year sometime, and said, listen, how do you feel about having one of those songs on the new Parralox album? Because I think 2 of the songs she did were Parralox songs anyway, that she liked. So she's like, yeah, I'd love to be on the album. So I'm very lucky to have Jane being on the album. Now, she's sung a song called Tears of Faith, and we are planning to record a video for that. We're hoping that it's going to be the lead single off the album. So I think we'll be recording a video for that very soon. And we had one concept for it, which we've now changed to an even better concept. And
Right.
I won't tell you what it is, but it involves mad scientists and resurrection.
Oh, well, that's total Jane Badler.
Yeah, so she is going to be amazing.
Yeah. John, there's so much more we could talk about. We've only skimmed across some of the stuff you do. But your mind, you haven't stopped. You've just told me so many stories. And
did you even get a word in? Have I just been talking the whole time?
I got the odd word in. I didn't need to, because you told so many wonderful stories. So John von Ahlen, thank you so much for chatting with us today.
We haven't even spoken about Neon Nights.
We haven't, but that's another story for another time, which is a show on Joy.
Which I wouldn't have been doing if it wasn't for you, David, so yeah.
That's right, I got you to do that, didn't I? I've forgotten about that.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
No, my pleasure. I'm David Hunt, and I'll see you again soon.